Hello once again, my friends. This is the second part of the Bible study for Holy Week 2020 for Wattana Church in Bangkok for the English congregation. And we are studying the temptations of Jesus with a focus on the first temptation. In the first section, I talked about how if we seek to control God, whether we understand that that is what we are trying to do or not, we are in danger of worshiping a God who is too small, just as the great Bible translator and teacher J.B. Phillips said in his book, "Your God is too small." There's a great danger in that. Let us be in a prayerful attitude once again as we study and learn together. I remind everyone who perhaps did not already know that I am recording this in my home because my building is on lockdown due to the COVID-19 pandemic in Bangkok. And once again, I also want to thank Ajahn Chilam Giat at Wattana Church for all of his skills in IT, because clearly I have very few. Many blessings, and let us continue studying together. So I suggested that being sure of everything can be very dangerous. It can be the very opposite of faith. Why would we need any faith in Jesus Christ at all? If we knew everything and we were sure and we were absolutely convinced of what would happen and that all our choices are right, certainty can be a dangerous thing. It can be the opposite of faith. And if we think that that's what Christianity offers us, all the right answers, and if we could just go to the Bible and find every right answer, we are missing a deeper understanding of what it means to trust our lives to God. Now, in studying what other teachers say about this story, there was one that stood out to me. There was a pastor who went on a trip with a group to Israel. And one of the places they went was to the wild area, the desert of Israel, to a place where many people believe is the very place that Jesus was tempted in the scripture. And this pastor found it to be very moving. They were up on sort of a hill and looking down on this valley, almost like the waves of the sea, the way the waves of the sand were, for miles and miles. And he said it was very lonely and so quiet. And it was also beautiful in a way. And each one of them had found a place to sit kind of apart from each other, and they were just sitting in the quiet, and he was coming to really sense the presence of God. But then the speaker for their group stood up and said, "Now I'm going to talk about the 5 ways that you can fight back against temptation." And somehow the holiness of the moment seemed just to be less somehow to that pastor who was listening. Somehow he said inside himself, in his own heart, he said, "Just give me Jesus." And this is what more than one scholar says on reading and studying this passage, let us look at Jesus, especially during Holy Week. It seems that it is right to stop looking so quickly at ourselves first. What does this story teach me? What can I get out of it? Can I use this story to make my life better? And just focus on Jesus in the story. The pastor thought in his heart, oh, just give me Jesus. Sometimes we can want to do the right thing before God, but sometimes in our very desire to do that, we can interrupt a powerful moment of holiness. Sometimes I wonder if that's what Peter was doing when Jesus was on the mountain of transfiguration with Peter and James and John. And remember, they saw this great vision of Jesus talking with Moses and Elijah, and there was such a bright light, and it was such a powerful and holy moment. And Peter started talking, well, here's what we should do. And the voice of God said, this is my son. Listen to him. Sometimes we can risk interrupting God's holiness. Remember what the prophet Habakkuk says in the 2nd chapter, the 20th verse. The Lord is in the holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence. Peter was the best of them in many ways. And yet Scripture is so honest. It tells us when he made mistakes, and he was not afraid to let that be known, even though he became perhaps the greatest and earliest leader of the church of the way of Jesus. So he has offered his own weakness to teach us, and we can be thankful for Peter in that way. But I'm reminded of a time when I was a college student many years ago, and my best friend and I had gone to a concert of the St. Matthew Passion, which is a great oratorio by Bach, perhaps one of the greatest or even the greatest composer who ever lived, depending on who you talk to. But Bach wrote this oratorio, the St. Matthew Passion, and it has choir and it has instruments and soloists, and it tells the story of Jesus' suffering and death. And the concert was probably about 2 hours long. And at the very end, when the choir had finished singing the final piece, and there was that few seconds of silence just before the audience begins to clap their hands and applaud for this amazing sharing of music. I think of it as a holy moment, and I was a music student, so I knew about that moment. When a piece of music comes to an end in a concert setting, and there is that precious moment of silence before people start to clap. Sometimes there is so much energy in that moment. But before anyone even thought about starting to clap their hands, an old man sitting right in front of us turned to his wife and he said, "Well, it's over." And those few silly words almost ruined everything. It seemed, at least to me, that the man had gotten nothing out of that evening of powerful and beautiful witness to the suffering and the sorrow of Jesus. And I've never forgotten that moment, unfortunately. Do we ever spend enough time in quiet just to focus on Jesus? As that one pastor thought to himself, just give me Jesus. I remember another time, another moment like that. I was 10 years old, and my family had the gift of being able to travel to the Holy Land at that time. And I remember going to the town of Bethlehem and into the Church of the Nativity, where people teach that Jesus was born. And in this church, you have to go downstairs underground to the very place that they say was the stable. And now it's decorated with beautiful colored mosaic stone everywhere. I was kind of expecting a wooden stable like I'd seen in church at Christmas. But when we came down into this area, and it's kind of small, it seemed to me, a choir was singing. And they were singing Silent Night. No instruments, a cappella. They were singing in harmony, and they were singing in French. And it turned out it was a group of French tourists who had come to this church, to this place, and their priest had come with them, and they were holding a service of prayer right here in the place where Jesus was born. And we had a tour guide, our family did, and I don't think he was a very devout man, and he also liked to be the center of attention. So right in the middle of this holy moment, he said very loudly, "And this is the place where the baby was born." And after that, he and the priest got in a shouting match, and it was sad and ridiculous and funny at the same time. That moment of interrupting a holy time and a holy sense of fellowship. So as we focus on Jesus, I wonder how he was able to shield himself from the arrows of the enemy. The story tells us that he had not eaten anything for such a long time. He was all alone. It was a very lonely place, even a desolate place, and he was exhausted in every way. And in that very situation of such tiredness and hunger, the very worst of testing came against him. In the very hardest of times for Jesus, the most difficult testing came against him. And I have just said that we should be careful at times reading scripture and turning too quickly to our own selves and what it says to us and how we can use it to learn and grow and so on. And sometimes we miss the opportunity just to be in the presence of God, and in this case, the presence of God as shown in the life and ministry of Jesus. And so it's true. In this story, we can't really avoid thinking about ourselves and the times we might have felt as tired, as worn out, as hungry and alone as Jesus may have felt in that moment. Many of us have felt and may even be feeling that way right now in this time of The COVID-19 pandemic around the world every day brings more frightening news. And as I said before, I'm filming this or videoing this on my home computer because my building is on lockdown right now. So in this time of danger, when everyone in the world has the same enemy and we all seem to realize it, and it is not a human being, this story may really call out to us and say, yes, haven't you sometimes felt that tired, that hungry, that alone, that vulnerable? So I'm not suggesting that it is wrong to read Scripture and think about our own lives. What I mean to say is it can be wrong to make that switch too quickly, because then we are in danger of treating the Bible and this story of Jesus as a thing that we can use. And so the sense of being in worship and prayer, even as we study and read the Scripture, is really important. And we mustn't forget that part. Let us remember that as we learn together about this passage, we are in prayer together. Prayer is not limited to making speeches to God. Prayer is the consciousness of being in God's presence and giving our hearts and minds and lives to God. So I think that in this time of testing, Jesus shows us something that the Apostle Paul later wrote about and taught about. That God's strength is made perfect when we are weak, even at our weakest. And Jesus came to be one of us. And he came in order, partly, to understand what we go through as human beings. He did understand. He does understand. The letter to the Hebrews tells us that. He understands the most painful, heartbreaking troubles of human life. So how was he able to stand against this testing, this temptation? What principle did he turn to when Scripture was being twisted right in front of him? Many teachers will say, well, he turned to the Scripture. The Scripture is the answer, of course. I think sometimes that is not enough of an explanation, because Satan knows all of the Scripture too and can quote it. I would suggest that at least one principle that Jesus turned to was the Great Commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength. And Jesus himself taught the second commandment is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And the people who would have heard this story in the beginning would have known right away that Jesus was, in a way, living out a parallel story to what the children of Israel went through in the wilderness when Moses was leading them. And this story has such similarities to that story. They would have seen it right away. The children of Israel, when they had escaped slavery in Egypt, with Moses as their leader, found themselves in the desert. They found themselves hungry. They became impatient. They looked for someone to blame. They even looked for someone to punish. And God fed them with manna so that they would remember, as Jesus quotes in this very story from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verse 3, so that the people would remember that human beings do not live on bread alone, but on everything that God speaks. Those early Christians would have noticed something else as well. They would have remembered that David, their great king, also went through a parallel story in his own life. David spent time in the desert. He had been forced out there by the jealousy of King Saul, who, in his actions, was in a way representing the Pharaoh of Egypt. In many people's minds, they would have seen that. The Pharaoh who was so cruel to the people in the story of Moses and the escape from slavery, the Exodus. David became hungry when he was on the run from King Saul, and David ate the holy bread which the priest Ahimelech gave him. Again, it was a sign to God's people that human beings do not live only on our own efforts, but on what God provides. And whatever is provided for us still comes from God. When David was wandering in the wilderness, he was also tempted to be cruel and arrogant, to be like King Saul, who had already failed in the eyes of God. And David was tempted to kill the king when the king was in a moment of weakness. David was tempted to hurry and become king in Saul's place because he knew that he was already anointed by the prophet Samuel. He knew that Saul had failed. And yet David does better than his ancestors did when they were following Moses. David refuses to stretch out his hand because Saul had been anointed by God. And David trusts and waits for God to put him on the throne at the right time, not to force it, not to rush it. So these stories of David, who became Israel's greatest king, who replaced Saul, can be found in the book of 1 Samuel. You have to read quite a bit of it to read this story, probably chapters 18 through 28. So two of Israel's greatest leaders, Moses and David, found temptation and struggle in the wilderness. And there were others throughout the stories of the children of Israel. Elijah, the prophet, spent time in the wilderness, a time of testing. So the earliest Christians would not have been surprised at all to hear that Jesus was tested in the wilderness. It was a tradition. And just as David did better than his ancestors when they escaped slavery, when they were led by Moses, so Jesus did better than all of them. So once again, I come back to the question, what was it that Jesus was tempted to do? I would suggest that in being told that he could just snap his fingers and turn stones into bread, this was a temptation to avoid suffering. And those who know the gospel stories know that this temptation came more than once. Remember when Peter insisted that Jesus should not have to suffer, when Jesus told them that, this was going to happen, that he would suffer and be killed, and he would rise again. But all Peter heard was the suffering. He says, no, Lord, that can't be. That can't come to you. And Jesus called him Satan. That makes a lot more sense when we remember this story. Jesus had already been tempted in this way in the desert, tempted to avoid suffering. It came again in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus knew his death was near, and in Holy Week we remember those moments very, very deeply.